The midnight train. It was a cold, rainy evening when Sarah boarded the last train of the night. She was heading home after a long day at work, her mind clouded with exhaustion. The train was almost empty, save for a few sleepy commuters scattered across the dimly lit carriage. As the train sped through the dark countryside, Sarah noticed something odd. Every station they passed seemed deserted. No passengers waiting, no lights on in the distance. Just an eerie, suffocating silence. She glanced at her phone, no signal. Strange. Usually, she could get a connection, even out here. The train began to slow down, but there was no station in sight. It lurched to a halt in the middle of nowhere, the rain pattering against the windows louder than before. The lights in the carriage flickered. Sarah's heart quickened. She looked around, and the other passengers remained unmoved, their heads hanging low as if they were asleep, or worse. Suddenly, she saw movement. A figure emerged from the darkness outside the train, slowly walking along the platform. But there was no platform, just overgrown grass. The figure, draped in a long coat, walked past her window without looking in, disappearing into the next carriage. Sarah stood up. The doors were still closed, and she hadn't heard anyone get on. Trembling, she stepped into the aisle, cautiously heading toward the next carriage. As she opened the door, the cold air rushed in, carrying with it a faint whisper. Something like, her name. Sarah. She froze, her pulse racing. The door to the next carriage creaked open on its own. She peered in, but there was no one there. Only the swaying of the train and the quiet hum of the engine. Suddenly, the lights went out completely. Panic seized her. In the dark, she heard footsteps approaching. Slow, deliberate, they stopped right behind her. Before she could turn, a voice, cold and hollow, whispered in her ear. You shouldn't be here. The lights flickered back on, and the train jolted forward. Sarah spun around. There was no one behind her. When she looked around the carriage again, all the passengers were gone. Every seat was empty, except for one at the far end. In that seat sat the figure she had seen outside. Its face was pale, almost translucent, eyes dark and sunken. It was staring straight at her. Sarah stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet. The train picked up speed, and the figure slowly stood up, walking toward her with unnatural grace. The door behind her flew open, and she ran, not looking back. But no matter how far she ran through the carriages, the figure was always just a few steps behind, growing closer with every heartbeat. The train began to screech as if it was tearing itself apart. Sarah reached the end of the last carriage. Her only option was to jump into the night, into the rain-soaked abyss. Before she could act, cold fingers wrapped around her wrist. She turned, coming face to face with the figure. It grinned, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. With a voice like cracking ice, it whispered, "Welcome to the midnight train. This is your final stop." The train vanished into the darkness, and Sarah was never seen again. Passengers still report strange occurrences on the midnight train, a shadowy figure wandering between carriages, searching for someone who boarded long ago.